A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to get a bit of a focus today, our attention on the digital ID and the evaporation of personal and religious freedoms, both here in Australia and in other Western nations around the world. Well, our special guest today says freedom rarely disappears overnight. More often, it's chipped away one common sense reform at a time. We might have been noticing that happen. Well, the latest nation to go down the digital identification path is Britain, where the Labor government in the UK is pushing for digital ID, and it has triggered a storm of public anger and accelerated a collapse in the polls for the government. Well, here in Australia, and this might even be news to you, our digital ID framework has already been legislated. Critics argue that digital IDs become tools of state control and of censorship and of repression. It's intimidating when you fear speaking up because you are under surveillance. So how do you feel about your personal data being collected and stored? Well, Damian Wyld leads the Australian Family Coalition. They're all about defending the family and promoting a society grounded on conservative Christian values and aspiring to safeguard our basic freedoms. Damian's joining us. Hey, Damian, welcome back.
Good morning, Neil. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Hey, just before we get into, the depths of this, and we'll try and get below the surface of shallowness and get into some deeper things today, but, we've heard from you over the years, and you've had a health crisis, and you've recovered, and we might even argue miraculously. How are you doing these days? You fighting fit?
I'm doing superbly well, Neil. Far better than can possibly have been expected, I think. In human terms, I think what has happened is just extraordinary, and I think it points to something much deeper, as many people have said. Certainly grateful for this second chance at life, and just trying to do my bit with this wonderful opportunity I've been given.
I wish we could tell the story again, but listeners can find a podcast and hear of your miraculous recovery. And here you are, testimony, fighting fit, and you're back in the game and defending freedoms. Hey, let's talk digital ID, Damian. Here in Australia, it is already legislated. That is still news to so many, but it seemed to have crept in, escaped under the radar a little when our government legislated for digital ID. And they're preparing now to allow all sorts of providers to join into that system. How do you reflect on what's happening in Australia before we touch on those things overseas?
Well, it's a little bit concerning, Neil. I mean, perhaps like the proverbial frog in a pot, the temperature in Australia has very slowly been turned up, not suddenly and overnight like we've seen in the UK, which has prompted this huge outpouring of, I think, anger and concern over where they're headed. But here in Australia, it has taken on a very subtle, very, as we said, sort of convenient sort of appearance to people that, those who are pointing out concerns and frustrations are having the finger pointed at them as conspiracy theorists for saying, well, hang on, this isn't the way to go here. Maybe we should stop and reconsider before we establish this framework, which could be used for all sorts of purposes if we don't actually do it properly.
Convenience and security too, those are the sorts of things that get argued, aren't they? Immigration numbers, the potential for dangerous people coming across borders. One of the excuses for collecting all this data and having a digital ID. These are the sorts of subtleties that bring these things in, isn't it?
Oh, certainly. I mean, in the case of the UK, the rationale for bringing in this system was proving a right to work. I was discussing this just with my son yesterday, and he's getting to that age where he will soon be looking for a job himself here in Australia. And he said to me, but what on earth do they need a digital ID for? Surely proof of a tax file number or equivalent would be enough to prove your right to work. And I thought, well, that's very common sense out of the mouth of a 15-year-old. But these people who are under the guise of convenience and safetyism are continuing to push more and more of these regimes on us.
And the issues that come up in the, the run-of-the-mill battles that are being fought around freedoms in the nation, these sorts of things become at the forefront, don't they? I mean, here in Australia, we're about to be the first country in the world to ban under 16s from having accounts on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and X and YouTube. But these sorts of things also, they create opportunity for the government to introduce these sorts of things. And I know that those sorts of things with the ban on under 16s on those social media accounts is being seen as one of the things that's going to push us into the use of digital IDs. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, that's a huge issue, Neil, and I think it's important at the outset to say that concerns for the welfare of young people online are quite justified. As a father myself, I'm constantly concerned about what my children might be exposed to, what sort of bad influences there are on the internet, when they're left to their own devices. So I think the role of social media particularly, which is a pervasive sort of thing, has encouraged peer bullying, all sorts of negative influences. We're right to be concerned about this and to do something about it. But what they're proposing by way of an age verification system for users, I mean, it's now a couple of months away, the rollout of this new system in Australia, and the details are still scant. And the concern is that it will apply to all and sundry, that we will all fall subject to this regime, if not at first in time, as they fine-tune it. And we'll see a huge erosion of privacy. We'll see a huge creation either publicly or privately of personal details, biometric data and so on. And then there's the overall interface with digital ID, which we're sort of discussing now, that it just creates a simpler regime for those who would seek to censor us and to stifle debate. We're already seeing that in Britain, where people are being arrested, in their pyjamas, having posted a meme the night before on Facebook. And the rollout of digital ID will do nothing to sort of calm concerns that this is where Britain is headed. And if we don't change path now, this is where we're headed to.
Yes, it's legislated here, but it's not implemented yet. You mentioned the word subtle. There's subtleties involved here, and, the right to work. Those sorts of things bring in that subtlety because the thought that, voluntarily we'll bring this in because people, won't they just see how valuable it'll be to give away all of their personal freedoms? That's the way it seems to work with this. People who are able to, in some sense, manipulate the emotional response of people to say this is a good thing when, in fact, there's some pretty dark downsides.
Oh, absolutely. And, I often hear that old furphy, well, if you've got nothing to hide, nothing that you're concerned about, if you've done nothing wrong, what do you have to fear from this? And unfortunately, I think that people do fall prey to that argument, and they shouldn't, because ultimately their privacy, their ability to sort of, work, much less go on the internet unhindered, provided they act within the constraints of the law, that's not something that governments should just take away.
Biometrics, even travelling. Now, I've just gotten back from some long service leave and I went to Europe and the UK. And, to get into the UK now, you need an ETA, which is an electronic travel authorisation. And you know what? Just from my mobile device, it needed my passport details and was able to do a scan of my passport with my mobile phone. Needed a digital photo. In fact, my mobile device took the digital photo that was uploaded immediately. So this sort of biometric data, scanning your face through your mobile phone, very, very easy for the government to be able to access all of that detail. And, once you're scanned, you're in the system worldwide. And as I am on that travel issue there. This is how easy it is to actually get everyone on side and on the books here.
Absolutely. And, it's difficult with things like national security to draw a sensible line, I think. I think there perhaps might be cases where, with the rise of international terrorism, it's very easy to explain to people, well, look, we need these particular measures to keep you safe. But, who watches the watchers, as the old Roman saying goes. The misuse of biometric data, the potential there is extraordinary. I just make one point. If your passwords are compromised, let's say to your email account, your banking system or whatever, you can get online right now and change it. If your face is misused or your fingerprints are misused, you don't get a second set. You can't go and reset those. You can't change those. So the way they could be misused, mismatched, cross-referenced, or even abused, in the case of people misusing your ID for nefarious purposes, there is nothing perhaps that you'll be able to do once the horse is bolted. So we need to think really carefully about setting up this system, which could be so easily abused.
I think these sorts of things do start with the good intentions, but you get transitions of leaders. Not everyone holds the same values, and the potential for the information gleaned and gathered to be used for a evil intent in the future. Is this part of where you are at at the heart of where a Christian might be concerned about these things?
Oh, look, I know people are concerned. The question, I think, is whether this is all by design or whether we are sort of sleepwalking into a surveillance state. I know there are people out there who would love more power, more control. There's an innate tendency towards that. There's that old famous dictum, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I think for the most part, most people do have good intentions. They think this would be easier, this would be convenient, this would give us this power, this would give us this ability. And even that in itself, to me, is almost an abuse of power when taken too far. The idea that we know better, the managerial class can just crack down because it's important for them to have the tools to do their job. The problem is when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you suddenly have abilities to censor online material, to monitor people, to even begin the soft introduction of a social credit style system like they have in China now. We are sleepwalking into this, whether we realise it or not. And I think it's probably time we stop pointing to people who are pointing out concerns and saying, look, you're all conspiracy theorists. I'm not even necessarily saying there's a conspiracy. I think it's happening. It's in our face. And we're just walking into it without actually thinking, is this a good idea or not?
It's almost as though it seems to be impossible to fight against it or turn back the tide because it's here or it's coming, and if it's coming in other nations, it's coming here as well. Sometimes there are groups within the Christian community who will stand up and be counted and say, there's no way that I will ever give in to having all of my data used the way we're talking about it today. But it may not even be possible to resist that. Do you get the impression that there is an opportunity to say, no, I won't participate, or really are you likely to just be caught up in this because you haven't got much of a choice?
Well, we sort of saw, and I'm sure your listeners will forgive me for saying this and making the analogy, but we saw something akin to that during the COVID period, when in some jurisdictions vaccine passports were introduced, and various businesses, employers, legislated that the vaccine must be required before either employment or before entry and similar. And that created a huge amount of division in the community between those who felt this was a good move and those who thought this was the most draconian thing ever. In terms of the path forward with things like digital ID and social media age verification, I've got friends on the social media front who are saying, well, that's it. Come December, I'm removing myself from all forms of it. I won't be on Facebook. I won't do this. I won't do that. You won't see me online anymore because I'm not going to give my details to the government. I understand those concerns. And they've asked me, what are you going to do? And I've simply said, well, I'm going to wait and see what happens. I think we have a mission. We have a need for AFC particularly to be online. I'm not going to panic just yet. I'm certainly going to see what the lie of the land looks like going forwards. And I hope that at some point common sense might prevail. Same with digital ID. It may be increasingly difficult to opt out of the system, certainly in the UK, where your very right to work could be inhibited in the very near future. I think what we need to undo it is a big enough public outcry against these measures, and then someone to take up the baton politically. In Britain, you've got groups like Reform, which are now, at least in the current polling, slated to have a huge overwhelming majority if an election were held now. But in Australia, we just don't see that same level of opposition. We've got bright lights like Senator Alex Antic, but we really need more people to step up to the plate.
So when you've got a digital ID, there is a sense in which the downside that can eventuate is that people who would be outspoken as an alternative narrative to a government's policy may be silenced because they are unable to speak up. We're talking about some freedoms. When you mentioned, the COVID passport, and we'll all remember that. You couldn't go to the restaurant if you didn't have a COVID passport. They weren't going to let you in. You had to sign in everywhere and, using your device and showing all sorts of proof that you were vaccinated. But the idea of silencing people, this is the downside. This is where you look to what the possibilities, the dark side might be, because as a Christian who embraces freedom, who is a champion of freedom, that freedom is likely to be evaporated to a point where you might not be able to speak out any time in the future. Is that the fear that we ought to hold?
Oh, I think certainly. And if we use the example of Britain as the canary in the coal mine, we've seen the evaporation of freedoms there. I personally know people who've been arrested because of mean tweets, mean things that have upset people that they've posted on the internet. I've seen these comments, and these are from good Christian people who wouldn't harm a fly, but someone took offence and they got hauled off in handcuffs in front of their children. This is the sort of police state that we will face if we don't actually speak now. On other fronts, like the work front, which is particularly where Britain is using as an introduction to the digital ID regime over there. I've seen people, and I've had people say to me, Damian, is this not mark of the beast sort of territory? And I had to stop and do a double take there because it talks about one not being able to trade, to buy and sell, and that would include one's labours. So without sort of wanting to delve into sort of apocalyptic talk, you can understand how genuinely felt these concerns are in the Christian community when they're saying those sorts of things.
Join the conversation. Text 0447 488 316 with a question or comment for today's guest. Text 0447 488 316 to make your voice heard. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Lots of impact that's happening in the UK right now, but, surprise to some, Australia's already legislated a digital ID, and there's going to be some private companies going to be implementing all sorts of things coming up very soon. Now, you can join us in the conversation on 1800 316 316. Our talkback line is open. You can send us a text on 0447 488 316. Damian Wyld is our guest. Hey, Damian, a couple of texts come through. Brett from Condobolin in New South Wales says, hello, Neil and Damian. Please comment on current Australian passports used as digital ID. We've had these for years. Yes, we've got sophisticated passports. Damian, any thoughts here for Brett?
I won't try and bluff my way through this one. I'm certainly aware of what he's talking about. In response to Brett, I know that some years ago we shifted from a plain old paper passport to one with the e-chip. I know that certainly expands surveillance and cross-agency sort of connections in knowing who's who at the zoo. Again, I think a lot of that was put forward in the aftermath of September 11th security concerns and the desire to make travel and so on more improve safety and defeat terrorism. But whether there are concerns linked to that, I can't comment. But are we all sort of tending in that direction of increased surveillance and so on? Yes, certainly so. The particular issue I probably can't comment further on.
No, and there's so many layers and dimensions around what could be considered to be surveillance, isn't there? So, hey, another text from Elizabeth in Taree. Elizabeth says, the problem is how do you fight it? Everyone wants to eat. Any thoughts here for Elizabeth?
Oh, well, that was pretty much what I was saying before. Britain is unfortunately leading the way in terms of where this could lead. Your ability to work could be linked to having one of these numbers, which could really make it hard for people. It could lock people out of the system, particularly, if it's taken on in the way we see in Britain. The government is not necessarily going to make it compulsory. They are simply doing it for ease's sake. And every large employer is simply going to say, well, this is easy. We're going to do it. We're not going to have people turn up here with passports and birth certificates and all this sort of nonsense anymore. You just give us a serial number and you can work for us. Or you don't have a serial number? Well, no, you can't work for us. And, God forbid the day that we see something like that here in Australia.
And, immigration, or you could call it illegal immigration, people arriving on boats, that is completely out of control in the UK, largely under control here, although we've got, our immigration rates just huge, people coming in legally. And so, in some sense, in the UK, that's where they're trying to weed out those illegal immigrants by way of being able to control and regulate the workspace. But here in Australia, that might not be the sort of excuse that government can use, although there might be all sorts of things around that. Hey, we're going to take some calls as well. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Let's squeeze in one before the news. Bridget is in Albany in WA. Hello, Bridget. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, Bridget. What are your thoughts for our conversation?
Yeah, just a couple of things and a question for Damian. I was one of the people in COVID who wouldn't take the jab, so lost my career, basically, and 2 weeks short of long service and all of that. So I guess having gone through that experience and taken a stand a few years ago, it's, absolutely not a surprise that this is all going to only get harder as we go along, and they really want to bring in this digital ID, don't they? But a couple of things I just wanted to mention. I don't know if one thing we found out, for people who have a self-managed super fund, it's already come through. You had to have, to access your super, your self-managed super, this process has already come through. The government has already set everything up for digital ID. This happened about a year ago for us. It was rushed through and there was no choice. So that was one point. It's already, like you say, it's coming through in various forms. That's sort of one of the ones that I've sort of picked up on already. Just another point, like with the churches that did not stand against this COVID stuff, and particularly the churches that run cafes as businesses, they need to make a decision with what's coming, because if you're going to lose your autonomy if you are, basically, if you're running a business through the church. That's another point. But I had a question for Damian. With what's coming in the mark of the beast, at what point does he sort of feel that people sort of, I know that social media and everything is great for outreach and sharing the gospel, but at what point, as a believer, do we need to say no and sort of pull back from all that?
Bridget, you're throwing him in the deep end and we're leading up to news, but quick response, Damian, for Bridget?
As quickly as I can, Bridget, firstly, thank you so much for your stance in times past. I know how many people suffered through that period, and there were some very, very brave souls. In terms of the last question, which I think is the most important one, and certainly in terms of self-managed super, I wasn't aware of that, but I am aware that it's come through in terms of company directorships and so on, so I imagine that was all linked to that at the same time. In terms of where to from here, I'm just taking each day as it comes. I think there'll be ample opportunity to see when things are coming to a point where Christians are either, unable to post freely online or being surveilled to a point where they say, I've had enough of this. And suddenly the cost benefit of being able to talk to their friends and being able to engage in outreach is just no longer a thing. But for the moment, I don't think we're there yet. And I think that it's time to engage as best as we can and try and use the internet and social media for all the benefits it can bring.
Before we talk about anything that the listeners are contributing, come back to something here, Damian, that we mentioned just during the news there. There are a lot of people who might already have a digital ID recorded, and they might even be unaware of it. Is that something that's possible, do you think?
I think a number of people will have had to go through that process. Like the lady earlier, I think it was Bridget, regarding the self-managed super fund. They basically were given the same choice as those who want to work in the UK. Do this or you can't have your super fund. Or in some cases, do this or you can't be a company director. They were sort of a gateway, I think, to this broader digital ID program. And it was all presented as very reasonable, just for a short, limited purpose, but now we see it expanding into something much bigger. And it begs the question, if something that seems so small and reasonable is already being expanded to be quite absolute, how much further can it go?
Yep. Hey, there was a question just before the news. We already answered it in some respect, but Elizabeth from Taree, who said the problem is, how do you fight it? And you indicated that here in Australia there's not much of an opposition at all to the digital ID. There's nobody who is shouting from the rooftops about the things that could go wrong here. How do you propose, Damian Wyld, that as a Christian believer you're concerned about freedoms, those freedoms and religious freedoms evaporating? How do you propose you actually get into the swing of resistance here?
I think there's a number of aspects to it, Neil. One is at the advocacy level and the other has to be at the political level, because ultimately this was legislated by Parliament. It can only be undone by Parliament. At the advocacy level, certainly get involved with organisations like ours. We'll certainly keep you in the loop, not just of what's happening, but in due course what can be done about it. And I'll come to one such example in a minute. But there's a lot of things people can do just as individuals, whether it's to talk to their friends at church, whether it's to contact their local MP. You don't necessarily have to wait for an organisation like mine to send an email saying, please contact your MP now. I think forging those individual relationships so that you can say, hey, look, Bob, hey, Jane, I'm concerned about this. I'm not some nutter, you know me. We've established a relationship, and I want to tell you there's deep disquiet over this and where it could lead. These are not conspiracy theories. You can see in Britain where it leads. We're not having to sort of make up the worst case scenario. We can actually point to it now and say, this is where Australia is headed, and I'm not happy about this as one of your constituents. And then there's the political side of it, because ultimately I do expect many MPs are probably not going to take you very seriously. In terms of the Labor Party, the government is for this, unfortunately, and the rollout is going to continue. So I would say to people who are really keen to do what they can, not just on this, but on any front, to get involved and actually join a political party. Join the party of your choice and look for good people you can rally behind who are actually going to pursue these issues, not just talk about them. One person I mentioned before the break was Senator Antic, and the reason I talked about getting involved, this is a prime time, he's just reintroduced his bill to repeal digital ID. Now, we all know the current makeup of the Parliament. There was a rather overwhelming result at the election just a few months ago. His chances are not flash, but Rome wasn't built in a day. Slavery wasn't undone by Wilberforce overnight. These sorts of pushes, these movements take time. And I think the day we basically give up and roll over is the day that we lose all of our freedoms.
So let's give some special honour here to Senator Alex Antic, and someone who in the Parliament is standing up and saying, no, this should not be happening. There must be ways to resist here. We've been talking about the UK and the UK Labor government collapsing in the polls, and there might be all sorts of reasons for that, but this would be one of those reasons. In the UK, there is a strong voice against this. Nigel Farage, who leads the Reform UK party, what do you understand about the way he approaches things?
I've followed Nigel's career for quite some years now. I first saw, probably like a lot of people, some of his rather inflammatory speeches in the Euro Parliament and followed him with interest ever since. I know there are mixed feelings on him, on some of his policies, I've even heard people call his sincerity into question, but I don't think you can doubt his authenticity. He's not a cardboard cutout politician. He's not afraid to be filmed eating or having a pint in the front bar. He's not stage managed, and he tends to speak from the heart. I think people are crying out for that in an era of stage managed, talking point driven politics, which we see both in Canberra and in Westminster. In Australia, we haven't really seen someone who's been able to cut through like Farage has in Britain. What he's been able to achieve in such a short space of time is nothing short of extraordinary. I think he holds 5 seats out of, 600 odd in Westminster at the moment. The polling I saw this morning, shared by Farage himself, they're on track for an absolute majority. Now, the general election in Britain is still years away, but even just to see a poll like that is an avalanche in political terms. I think that political parties in Australia would do well to look at Britain, not just for what could go wrong in a legislative and policy sense like digital ID, but to have a look at what could go wrong for them politically. Because if they don't snap out of this tin-eared approach of stage-managed, talk point-driven, focus group guided politics, then a Nigel Farage could certainly arise in Australia too.
Yes, Nigel Farage, certainly a disruptor, and as you say, if there was an election held tomorrow, as the commentators say, he would actually be the new Prime Minister. And that's interesting because, he's leading a party that's come from nowhere. Hey, let's just spend a few moments here. I've got one question here. This is a little bit, I'll let you make a judgment here. James in Kyabram in Victoria, sorting the sheep from the goats. He's reflecting on one well-known great late Bible teacher, Chuck Missler, who shared the original papyrus of John on Patmos, reference to the writer of the book of Revelation. He says it had to be the terrorist symbol's half-crescent moon drawn on top of the 666. If those numerals existed then, I'm starting to question. Now, I'm not sure if you were even aware of all of those sorts of things, Damian, but coming back to this sort of apocalyptic idea of this could be a connection with a mark of the beast of end times, and not everybody is on that same eschatological page, but clearly here's James posing the question again and looking at that sort of apocalyptic language and referencing some Bible teachers who've had some evidence of these things. Any quick response here for James?
It's funny, that's the second time I've heard John on Patmos mentioned in recent times. Not so long ago, I actually happened to find myself in the Greek islands some months ago. Not on Patmos, but not far away. I was on an island called Paros, and I found myself thinking about that good saint in his hovel, in exile there, writing. To answer James's question, though, there's certainly disquiet. There are always people looking for signs of the times. There are always people wondering if this latest war in the Middle East or the introduction of this particular law, is a sign of where we're at. I'm not game to say because, no one knows the hour except the Father. But I will say this: when people are concerned by it, I think that's a sign that something is very deeply wrong. People don't necessarily go making those sorts of connections and having those sorts of concerns unless there is something very, very disquieting about it. And with digital ID, that is very much the case. So I think, we need to take this seriously, and most importantly, we need to do something about it.
Thanks, James, for making that point. Another text from Anna from Tasmania. And let me just say, you can send us a text on 0447 488 316. And Anna says, hi, I'm listening to your show. Important topic that concerns all Australians. I believe the best course of action is to boycott businesses that are participating in digital identity requests, etc., and to keep using cash as much as possible. Boycotting and not participating are strong messages to the system. Thanks for bringing this up, as things will change quickly if we don't push back. Keep up the good work. Thoughts here for Anna? Damien.
There's always a place for boycotts. I think sometimes people are too quick to call for one and they lose their efficacy. But with something like this, that's certainly worth considering. The question is, though, how is it possible? We haven't really seen yet who will want a digital ID and how withholding one might be possible. In Britain, it's actually going to become very hard very quickly. Unless you're doing some dodgy cash-in-hand job, you may be locked out of the employment system altogether. So I certainly sympathise with what Anna's saying, but it begs the question of what the lie of the land will look like. And I've forgotten the second half of the question, Neil.
Boycotting, not participating are strong messages
and cash,
to the
cash,
system. Yeah, cash in the...
Look, certainly there are concerns over the rise of not just electronic transactions, but now even digital currencies, because governments are starting to move beyond, private forms of cryptocurrency and are establishing their own centrally controlled digital currencies. There are great fears over this, which could be linked to digital ID and online surveillance, including if the government actually controls, there is no physical currency potentially anymore. If the government actually controls all currency, can put restrictions and caveats on it. I've heard all sorts of suggestions as to putting a time limit on the use of currency. It'd have an expiry date. I don't know. But it strikes me that all these things are possible. And a bit like digital ID, we would do really well to ask ourselves why and should we before we embark in any particular direction. So, I'm the worst culprit. I flash my credit card umpteen times a day. But do I see a need to retain cash and to try and preserve a cash culture? Absolutely. I think it's very important.
Wonderful. And a text from Nadina. And Nadina says, God asked me to tell my story, and it's been guiding me to, has been guiding me to set up a social media presence and YouTube channel, which delves into mental health and freedom of truth, discussing surviving suicide and trauma recovery stance. My question is, how can I protect my safety whilst also being a public face and service? Thanking you for your time and take care. Thoughts here for someone who wants to get into the social media space. I suspect here Nadina is saying, I'm maybe likely to overstep the mark and say the wrong thing that might be counter to a government narrative here. And am I at risk? What are your thoughts for Nadina?
It's a good question, and these are questions that have been asked by people in all parts of the world, political dissidents, for example, who are speaking out against their regime. There is no simple, easy answer to this one. There have been people who've used, and I'm probably going to get a call from the police after saying what I'm about to say. There are people who use, VPNs online to hide their identity. They go and have anonymous blogs and so on. Very careful to sort of cover their steps. And I say that people have done that in sort of war-torn situations and dictatorships. But in a place like Australia, the thing I would say to a person wanting to sort of put their head up above the parapet is you have to be prepared for it. I don't think this is a culture and a society which really responds too well to people acting in the shadows and in secrecy. People are looking for their Nigel Farage. People are looking to be inspired. I feel that most of AFC's material being very text-heavy and very email-heavy, we've not delved enough into the audio, the podcast, and the video world. That's something we're certainly looking at in future. But people need to see a human face, one that they can trust, one that can establish credibility with them. And can you protect yourself? Well, ultimately, no, not necessarily. And I'm not even talking about government surveillance. There are going to be people out there who violently disagree with you. There are going to be people who issue death threats. In the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, Neil, I had cause to reflect on this, and I went back through my messages. I thought I'd long deleted them, but no, I found all sorts of beautiful comments left for me during the marriage campaign back in 2017, issuing me all sorts of threats. And this is just part and parcel of public life. I'm nobody in particular. I'm sure there are MPs out there like Alexander who probably get threats all the time. Unfortunately, it's just part and parcel of being in public life. And I would encourage anyone considering venturing out to pray and discern very carefully, because it's not without its difficulties.
And we're all encouraged to count the cost if you want to be a believer, and that's difficult and challenging, but that might be something we all need to do for the future. Hey, let's take a call. Pinky is from Regency Downs. Pinky, are you driving your truck today?
No, Neil, actually I'm at home. I'm doing a bit of clean up and tidy up, yeah.
Okay. What have you got to contribute to our conversation all about digital ID?
Yeah, just when I've been listening to you this morning, both of you, Neil, you probably remember Barry Smith from New Zealand?
It's a long time ago, but yes, I do remember Barry Smith.
Yeah, Barry had a few interesting insights to what's going to transpire on that for this ID number and stuff back in the day, and it's it's sort of like coming more and more closer. And what he was saying is it's the control that they want to put on under the illusion that it's going to be safer for people and more security, less fraud and all that sort of stuff. They put that forward up front. But the social economic disaster that can come behind it is the control factor and the manipulation of people that don't want to go with the system.
People who are politically motivated and our political parties, they all have their spin doctors who are in charge of the public relations of the party, and that's a necessary part. You've got to be able to put an argument. But let me just bring in Damian here. Damian, you're thinking around what Pinky is saying here. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know Barry Smith, but I think the sort of concerns that are being voiced are sensible ones. There have been people warning about the push in these sorts of directions for a long time. I was just thinking during the break, Neil, I was very young. I was only a primary school student when this occurred, so it's not something I'm particularly familiar with personally. But the Australia card, that was not even applying a serial number to someone that they had to punch in everywhere, but the very idea of having a centralised identity system. You could basically be asked to show your papers like some draconian totalitarian state. Australia said no to that 40 years ago, and yet here we are in much the same place.
Pinky, I want to thank you for making your contribution, and we may need to actually put a line under any other calls and any other texts at this point. I want to spend just a couple of minutes here, and I almost think we should have been talking about this a lot earlier in the conversation, but freedom for Christian believers, Damian, there's some really foundational things. As Christians, we're not slaves. We're image bearers for God. And, when we think of, just passing through, citizens of heaven, first of all. But there's an obligation, isn't there, in some sense, on the heart of the Christian believer to stand up for those who are oppressed. So speaking against oppression isn't something that Christians ought to be holding back on. And Christians, we are the champions of being able to make moral choices, choices for good according to a biblical pattern, not for evil. And of course, the gospel message in itself is a liberating message. So we are, in some sense here, champions of freedom. So if we don't say anything about these things and they just overtake us, we're missing the point here. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here on Christians and freedom and what really, ought to motivate our hearts.
Neil, you haven't really left me anything to say.
Sorry about that.
No, you've said it so perfectly. And you're right. I think, Christians have a unique way, or should have a unique way of looking at this, because we can talk about it in a very secular way, that we're just about rights and freedoms. But really, if we consider that we have a duty to do these things, we have a duty to live out our faith, which extends beyond what we do on a Sunday morning. I don't think that our political elites have ever really understood that freedom to practice your faith needs to be a 24/7 thing. And then beyond that, the need to engage in evangelism and so on. You can see where all of these trends are leading to a place where that mission will be utterly stifled if we don't speak up now and do something about it.
Okay. And, hey, let me just say, for listeners, and Damian said a little earlier, they're going to be talking about these things. To stay in the loop, how do you actually keep abreast of all of this information? We'll have some more conversations, no doubt, as these things begin to unravel here in Australia and digital ID becomes much more the focus. But Damian, Australian Family Coalition, this is an area you are interested in, and you're likely to be keeping your followers afloat with understanding these sorts of things. Tell me about your organisation as it stands at the moment, the Australian Family Coalition. How do people connect with you? Do you subscribe? What's the way that things operate?
Good question, Neil. A couple of good things people can do right now. So you mentioned our website earlier, which is www.ostfamily.com.au. If you venture there, there's an easy spot where you can join up. You don't need a digital ID. If you just give us your name and your email.
Tick that box.
Absolutely. And we'll send you out regular updates from there. We also have quite an active presence on Facebook, and we'd welcome you on there if you're still on social media.
And, there's been a flurry of activity on the phone and some texts, but I'll have to draw a line under those. Thanks to everyone who tried to get through. And if we didn't get to your text, apologies for that. You know what? It's been a great conversation, Damian Wyld. It's one of those ones you just have to talk about these things. And even talking about them may be a risky thing for the future, but we'll talk about those things now while we're comfortable to do so. Damian Wyld leads the Australian Family Coalition. He mentioned that website, ostfamily.com.au, ostfamily.com.au. Become a subscriber there and get some regular updates. And, there might even be a few dollars you can send their way too. Undoubtedly, there's always financial needs in any organisations like Australian Family Coalition. Damian Wyld, thanks so much for sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be here.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.